She was told to wait outside. That is where we begin. Not with medals, not with the citation that fills 3 pages of dense official text in the Pentagon's Records Division. Not with the photograph that hangs, framed in quiet mahogany, on a wall most people in this world will never see. We begin in a corridor. A narrow steel corridor aboard a warship cutting slowly through water the color of hammered copper, 7 miles off the coast of a place that does not forgive mistakes. We begin with a woman standing still, a worn notebook tucked under one arm, and a young man blocking a hatch with his body, his voice loud enough to carry, because that is what young men with just enough authority and just enough insecurity do. They make sure the corridor hears them. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to step back." He said it the way people say things when they want the words to land in front of an audience. Not to inform, to perform. This is a classified briefing. CIC is restricted to authorized personnel. He shifted his weight to fill the hatchway more completely. He was Petty Officer Second Class Rendell, 26 years old. 14 months at sea, sharp creases in his uniform. The kind of young man who had learned, correctly, that rules exist for reasons, and had not yet learned, correctly, that rules also have authors. He looked at her the way people look at someone they have already decided does not belong. She was in her mid-50s. Her khakis were unmarked, no insignia on the collar, no name tape visible from the angle he was looking. She was not a tall woman. She was not an imposing woman in any of the ways the word imposing is usually meant. She had gray at her temples, and the particular kind of stillness that comes not from passivity, but from a person who has, over a very long time, learned that stillness is more efficient than motion in almost every situation that matters. Her eyes were the color of the water outside the hull. They were calm. They were not anxious. They were not offended. They were simply present, the way the sea is present, noting everything, reacting to nothing. She said nothing. Rendell took that silence as permission to continue. "Look," he said, dropping his voice into a register he probably thought sounded reasonable. "I don't know who brought you aboard or what the admin situation is, but I cannot let unauthorized personnel into an active combat planning session. It's not personal. It's procedure." He said it loud enough that 2 junior enlisted sailors passing in the corridor behind her slowed their pace slightly. They heard. That was the point. She held the notebook against her side. She looked at him with those water-colored eyes. She waited. Now. Before we go further, before the briefing stalls and the chart comes out and the room goes quiet, before the commander steps into the corridor and says the words that will change the temperature of the air. Before all of it, we need to understand something about this corridor, about this ship, about the particular July morning that is pressing itself against the hull of the USS Bataan with all the indifferent weight of the Persian Gulf in midsummer. Because there is something happening in that hatchway that Petty Officer Rendell cannot see. There is something that the 2 sailors who slowed their pace in the corridor cannot see. There is, in fact, only one person in that entire section of the ship who can see it, and he is standing 15 feet behind Rendell, in the shadow of a frame support where the overhead lighting does not reach, watching with an expression that is not amusement and is not alarm, but is something in the precise middle of those 2 things. Master Chief Petty Officer Eugene Watts, 31 years in the United States Navy. He had done things in places that are not on any map that will ever be made public, and he had stood beside people who had done the same, and he had developed, over the course of those 31 years, a very specific kind of vision. It is the kind of vision that does not look at rank or uniform or the volume of a person's voice. It looks at how they stand, how they breathe, where their eyes go when they are not being watched. He was watching her now, and he was very, very still himself. Because what he was seeing, in the posture of that unremarkable-looking woman with the worn notebook and the unmarked khakis, was something he had not seen in a corridor of a ship since the last time he had stood beside someone who carried that much quiet authority that none of it needed to be visible. The kind of person who, if you locked them in a room with every decoration stripped away, every insignia removed, every title erased, would still, within 20 minutes, be the person everyone else in the room was looking to. He did not move. He did not speak. He wanted to see what she would do. She had not moved. She had not spoken. She was waiting. And Master Chief Watts, watching from the shadow of the frame support, understood something that Petty Officer Rendell did not. The waiting was not resignation. The waiting was not discomfort endured. The waiting was something else entirely. It was the patience of someone who has been in this exact situation, or something like it, enough times to know precisely how it ends, and who has made a very specific and deliberate choice about how to conduct herself in the meantime. If you believe that true strength is measured not in volume but in silence, not in the loudness of a person's certainty, but in the depth of what they know, type the word competence in the comments below. This story is for you. The Strait of Hormuz in July is not a place that invites distraction. 21 miles at its narrowest point, the pressure of roughly 30% of the world's seaborne oil passing through it in any given month. On the Iranian side, the Revolutionary Guard Corps naval forces operating a doctrine that military analysts have spent decades studying and still cannot fully predict. Fast attack craft, swarms of small, agile vessels that can appear and disappear in the radar clutter of a coastline that is not simple and is not forgiving. Silkworm batteries in the hills, shore-based radar that does not announce itself. The USS Baton, an amphibious assault ship carrying a Marine Expeditionary Unit and the full complement of aircraft and support systems that entails, had been operating in the Gulf for 11 weeks. The world outside the hull had grown more complicated in that time. Diplomatic channels that had been warm in April were cold in June, and something beyond cold in July. There had been an incident. The details of the incident are not important to our story, except in this one regard. A staging area near Bandar Abbas, on the Iranian coast, had become the focus of urgent attention from several people whose job it is to think about such things. The staging area was being used to marshal a swarm of fast attack craft. The intelligence was solid. The targeting package was assembled. The strike option had been prepared, reviewed, and approved up a chain of command that reaches to places we will not name. There was one problem. There was a corridor of restricted airspace that had not existed in any database 3 weeks ago. It had appeared in the navigational records quietly, without announcement, an amendment buried in the kind of bureaucratic sediment that accumulates in maritime authority agreements between nations that are not enemies and are not friends, and are something more complicated than either. It overlapped, precisely, with the optimal flight path of the strike package. Going around it added time, added exposure, changed the calculus in ways that made several people in the briefing room deeply unhappy. Nobody in the briefing room could explain it. Nobody in the briefing room knew where it had come from, who had authorized it, or how to challenge it without risking a diplomatic consequence that nobody wanted. The briefing had been running for 47 minutes. It was stalled. Commander Elise Parrish stepped out of the Combat Information Center and into the corridor with the particular energy of a person who has been trying to solve an equation for nearly an hour and has just accepted that the equation requires a variable she does not have. She was a capable officer. She had a good mind for operational complexity. She had, at this particular moment, the expression of someone whose good mind had reached its edge. She almost walked past the woman with the notebook. Almost. Something made her stop. It was not the woman's bearing, though the bearing was, to anyone paying attention, remarkable in its calm. It was not the eyes, though the eyes were the eyes of a person who was not lost, and was not waiting to be rescued, and was not in any of the states of mild or acute distress that Commander Parrish associated with someone who had been told to wait in a corridor for an unknown period of time. It was something simpler than that. It was the worn notebook, a specific kind of worn, the kind that comes from years of actual use, of being opened in field conditions and briefing rooms and the back seats of vehicles and the decks of ships in all weathers, pages dense with marginalia, with the sediment of a long career of thinking hard about complicated things. Commander Parrish looked at the notebook, and then she looked at the woman holding it, and something in her very capable operational mind filed a flag. "Ma'am," she said, "are you waiting for someone inside?" The woman with the notebook looked at her. Those gray eyes, that extraordinary calm. "I was told to wait out here," she said. Her voice was moderate. It was not bitter. It was simply informational. Parrish's gaze moved to Petty Officer Rendell, who had the decency to look slightly less certain of himself than he had been 30 minutes ago. "Rendell? Ma'am, I don't have her on the access list, and she doesn't have visible credentials, and the CO's standing order for this briefing is—" "I understand the standing order." Parrish looked at the woman again. "I apologize for the wait. Can I ask your business today?" The woman tilted her head slightly, not with impatience, with something more like a person choosing, from among several possible responses, the one that is most useful. "You have a navigation deconfliction problem," she said. "Restricted airspace. Appeared about 3 weeks ago. No explanation in the current database." Parrish went still. "How do you know that?" The woman held up the worn notebook slightly. "Because I have a copy of the amendment that created it, and because I know what it is." A pause. Brief, precise, the length of a single breath. "If it would be helpful, I could look at your chart." The corridor held its breath. Master Chief Watts, in his shadow, was no longer trying to contain his expression. Something had moved in his face, not quite a smile, something older and quieter than a smile. Commander Parrish made a decision. She had been an officer long enough to know that the most dangerous thing in a briefing room is the wrong assumption, and the most valuable thing in a briefing room is the person who has the right answer, and that those two things are often, in the United States Navy, found in packages that do not look the way you expect them to look. "Please come in," she said. Petty Officer Rendell moved to the side. He did not say anything. He watched the woman with the notebook walk past him and through the hatchway and into the Combat Information Center with the same efficient, unhurried step that had been her only movement for the last 40 minutes. The hatch closed. In the corridor, there was silence. Master Chief Watts stepped out of the shadow of the frame support and walked, without rush, toward a position where he could see through the small port light in the hatch. He had a very specific feeling about what was about to happen, a feeling built from 31 years of watching people walk into rooms, and he intended to see it. Inside the Combat Information Center, 8 officers and senior enlisted personnel were arranged around a large chart table. The overhead lights were cold and fluorescent. The screens around the perimeter of the compartment glowed with tactical overlays, radar sweeps, and data feeds that never stop moving. Because on a ship in the Strait of Hormuz in July, data never stops moving. 8 pairs of eyes looked at the woman who walked in. She did not look at all of them. She looked at the chart. She crossed the compartment with the notebook under her arm and stopped at the edge of the chart table and looked at the problem that had stopped the briefing. The restricted airspace corridor, the overlay of the proposed flight path, the numbers that didn't add up. She looked at it for a long time. 60 seconds, perhaps a little less. The room watched her. Nobody spoke. Commander Parrish had entered behind her and was standing with her arms folded, watching with an expression that was carefully neutral, the expression of someone who has made a commitment and is seeing it through. The woman set the worn notebook on the edge of the chart table. She reached into it and produced, from somewhere in its densely annotated interior, a folded card. It was laminated. The lamination was old, slightly yellowed at the edges. The card itself, the size of a large index card, dense with text in a font too small to read from any distance. She unfolded it. She looked at it. She looked at the chart. She placed one finger on the chart at a specific coordinate, then moved it to a second, then a third. This corridor, she said, runs from here to here, along this bearing. Her voice was still that same moderate informational tone. She was explaining something to a room. She was not performing. It appeared in the navigational records on July 3rd. It has no formal public announcement because the amendment that created it was filed as a supplementary modification to the 2019 Maritime Authority Agreement between the United States and the UAE. Specifically, the 2019 amendment to Article 7 of that agreement, a silence that was so complete it had a physical texture. She held up the laminated card. This is a personal copy of that amendment. I've been carrying it for 7 years. She set the card on the table, face up, beside the chart. The corridor exists because of a deconfliction agreement I negotiated personally in March of 2019 with the UAE Maritime Authority, at the request of Navcent, to create a protected transit lane for specific categories of UAE Federal Authority maritime assets. The coordinates were agreed on because they don't conflict with any U.S. operational pattern that existed in March of 2019. She looked up at the room. They conflict with your current strike package because your current strike package uses a flight corridor that was established in 2023. The amendment predates that corridor by 4 years. You would need to either repackage the flight path using the eastern approach, which adds 11 minutes but keeps you entirely clear of the restricted zone, or file a temporary waiver through Navcent citing operational necessity, which I can support in writing if needed. The waiver processing time, if filed in the next 2 hours, is approximately 4 hours. A fractional pause. The eastern approach is cleaner. She folded the laminated card. She put it back in the notebook. She picked up the notebook. She looked at Commander Parrish. "That's the problem," she said. "That's the solution. You have good people in this room. They would have found it. It would just have taken longer." Commander Parrish was looking at her with an expression that had moved well past carefully neutral into something that was, behind the careful officer's face, close to awe. "I'm sorry," Parrish said, and her voice had changed, a half-register shift that people who have been in uniform for a long time recognize because it means the speaker has just revised their understanding of the situation. "But I don't believe I've been properly introduced." The woman's expression did not change. She looked, if anything, mildly patient. "No," she said, "you haven't." Parrish looked at the laminated card, now back inside the notebook. Then she looked at the woman's unmarked collar. Then she pulled the tablet from the clip at her belt, the ship's official chain of command directory, the one that includes contact information, billet assignments, and the one-line service summary for every flag officer attached to any command in the region. She opened it. She typed. She found the name. The tablet screen faced her for 3 seconds, while Commander Elise Parrish, a capable and composed officer of the United States Navy, did something she almost never did. She went pale. Not the dramatic pallor of shock depicted in films, a specific, quiet draining of color from a face that had just understood something, with a completeness that left no room for anything else. She turned the tablet around and held it toward Petty Officer Rendell, who had followed the woman inside, some instinct he could not name pulling him through the hatch and into the compartment, standing now at the back of the room beside the door. "Petty Officer Rendell," Parrish said. Her voice was level, precisely level. He looked at the tablet. He read the name. He read the rank beside the name. He read the billet description below the rank. If you have been in a room when someone reads something that rearranges everything they thought they understood, you know the particular quality of the silence that follows. It is not an empty silence. It is a full one. It is a silence that contains, if you listen carefully, the sound of an entire set of assumptions collapsing. 2 stars. Rear Admiral. Deputy Commander, Naval Forces Central Command. 7 combat deployments across 3 decades in uniform, 4 of them to this exact theater. The negotiating authority for 3 bilateral maritime agreements, including one that had just prevented a diplomatic incident and solved a targeting problem that a room full of capable officers had been unable to crack for 47 minutes. The woman with the worn notebook was a Rear Admiral. Her name was on the orders for this operation. Her name had been on the briefing list since the morning. Petty Officer Second Class Rendell stood at attention. He stood at the absolute and complete stillness of attention, the kind that is not performed and is not chosen, but simply happens when the body understands something the mind is still processing. He did not speak. There was nothing, in this moment, to say. The Admiral looked at him. Not with anger. It is important to understand that. She looked at him with those gray eyes, that water-colored calm, and the look contained no anger and no relish and no desire to make this moment larger than it needed to be. She had been in enough rooms, over enough years, to know that this young man's mistake was not a failure of character. It was a failure of context. He had applied the rules he knew to a situation he didn't have enough information to read correctly. That is a very human thing to do. She had done versions of it herself, a long time ago, in a different corridor on a different ship, and someone with enough patience had corrected her, and she had never forgotten it. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she looked at Commander Parrish. "The eastern approach," she said. "Get it moving. You have a window in." She glanced at the tactical display on the nearest screen. 6 hours and 14 minutes, and you want margin. Parrish straightened. "Yes, ma'am." "And someone should get me a chair," the Admiral said, not unkindly, with the faintest suggestion of wry humor in an otherwise level voice. "I've been on my feet since Bahrain." If there was. In that compartment, something that moved through the air, like the releasing of a long-held breath, like a room remembering how to breathe. Nobody would have been able to point to it. But it was there. Master Chief Watts, who had been watching through the port light, stepped back from the hatch and stood in the corridor for a moment with an expression on his face that, if he had been asked to describe it, he probably could not have, because some things that happen in corridors on ships are too precise to name. He had known. From the moment he had seen her walk through the passageway, he had known with the certainty of 31 years of watching people who carry weight walk through the world. He straightened his own uniform, out of instinct, out of habit, out of simple respect. Then he went to find a chair. If stories like this mean something to you, you can help keep them coming over on Patreon. The link is right there in the description below. Now, back to the Strait of Hormuz, and to what happens next. Because what happens next is not the dramatic confrontation that part of us expects. There is no dressing down, no formal reprimand delivered in front of the assembled room, no moment in which the admiral raises her voice and makes the young petty officer understand, with the full authority of her rank and her record, exactly what he did wrong. That is not what happens. What happens is simpler than that, and for that reason, it is more permanent. The chair was brought, a plain chair, the kind that exists in their hundreds on a ship of this size. The admiral sat in it, in a corner of the compartment, where she was out of the way of the organized activity now beginning to move around her as the briefing room reconfigured itself around the Eastern approach, around the solution she had given them in 60 seconds, around the momentum that had been restored. She opened her notebook. She read. She made occasional brief notes in the margins of what was already there. When she was asked a question by one of the officers working the revised targeting package, she answered it, precisely, briefly, with the accuracy of someone who has spent a long time being the person in the room who knows the exact right answer to this kind of question. She was, in every observable regard, a professional doing her job. Petty Officer Rendell remained in the compartment. He had nowhere else he was required to be, and something in the architecture of the moment seemed to require him to remain, to witness what he had blocked, and then what he had failed to understand, and then what he had just been shown. He stood near the hatch. He did not try to make himself invisible, though part of him very much wanted to. He stood at a respectful parade rest and watched. And this, in the opinion of several people who were in that compartment, was the correct thing to do. Not because he was being punished, but because the best education in any profession is direct observation of mastery, and he was currently in the presence of a master, and the honest thing, the correct thing, the thing that would serve him better than any formal reprimand, was to watch and to understand. He watched. He understood. Or began to. The full understanding would come later, in the way that the full understanding of things that happen to us at significant moments always comes later, in the quiet hours, when the events have had time to settle and be looked at from the angles that were not visible in the moment itself. Outside the hull, the Strait of Hormuz moved past the ship in its hammered copper indifference. The same water it has always been, older than any of them, older than the flags they serve, older than the concept of a flag. The aircraft launched at the appointed hour. The eastern approach worked exactly as the admiral had said it would. No complications, no restricted airspace conflicts. Clean ingress, clean egress. The strike package executed with the precision that it had been designed to execute with. The staging area near Bandar Abbas denied its purpose by a precise, professional, rehearsed application of force that left no margin for error, because the people who planned it and executed it were, in all the ways that mattered, very, very good at their jobs. The admiral did not watch the aircraft launch from the flight deck. She was in the compartment. She watched the screens. She noted the progress of each aircraft on the tactical display with the focused attention of someone for whom this is not theater and is not excitement and is the simple, grave, ordinary weight of an operation that has consequences and that requires, therefore, the most careful and sustained attention a person can bring to it. When the last aircraft returned, she closed her notebook. She stood. She looked at Commander Parrish. "Good work," she said. 2 words, spoken the way someone speaks, 2 words that contain a great deal more than 2 words worth of meaning when they come from the right person. Parrish stood a little straighter, not from instruction, from instinct. The admiral picked up her notebook, tucked it under her arm, and walked toward the hatch. She paused when she reached Petty Officer Rendell. He came to attention. She looked at him for a moment. Those gray eyes, that absolute stillness. "You applied the rules you knew," she said. "That's what you should do. Next time, apply them with a little more information." A brief pause. The silence between the two sentences was the length of a breath. "The rules exist to protect the mission. Make sure you know enough about the mission to protect it correctly." She held his gaze for 2 seconds. Then she walked through the hatch and into the corridor. And she found a quiet corner to wait for a transport back to Bahrain, because she had 3 other things to do today, and the day was not over. Now, some things that happened after. Petty Officer Second Class Rendell was not formally reprimanded. This was a choice, made at several levels of the chain of command, that was itself instructive. There are moments in a military career when the error a person makes is so precisely educational that a formal process would diminish its power. The system, in its wisdom, recognized this as one of those moments. What Rendell received was not a report, but a conversation. Several conversations, in fact, over the following days, with people at various levels of the chain of command who had, in the specific way that these things work in a working military, heard about what had happened in the corridor of the USS Bataan in the Strait of Hormuz on a July morning. The conversations were not punitive. They were instructive. And they were, for Petty Officer Second Class Rendell, the most important conversations of his career to that point. Not because they were difficult, though some of them were, but because they came from people who had themselves made versions of this mistake, who had themselves stood in corridors and made assumptions about the person on the other side of an unmarked uniform, who understood from personal experience what it costs to be wrong about that kind of thing, and who wanted, genuinely, for him not to carry that cost any larger than necessary. He did not carry it larger than necessary. He carried it exactly as large as it was, which was large enough to be instructive for a very long time. He made Chief Petty Officer 4 years later. He was known, among the people who worked for him, as someone who asked more questions before drawing conclusions than almost anyone else they had encountered. Someone who had an unusual patience with the evidence before he allowed himself to form a view. Someone who, when training junior sailors on access control procedures, always included, a specific and extended section on the difference between the letter of the rule and the spirit of it, and on why the spirit of it is the thing you are actually there to protect. He never explained where that emphasis came from. He didn't need to. Master Chief Eugene Watts retired from the United States Navy 14 months after the morning in the Strait of Hormuz. At his retirement ceremony, attended by a gathering of officers and sailors who had served with him across the better part of 3 decades, he was asked, as people are asked at such ceremonies, to say a few words about what the service had taught him. He was not a sentimental man. He was a direct man, a practical man, a man who had spent 31 years being exactly as precise as the situation required, and not 1 degree more. He said this. He said that the most important thing the Navy had taught him was the difference between what a person looks like and what a person is. He said that the two are almost never the same. He said that in his experience, the greater the gap between the surface and the substance, the greater the substance tends to be, because people who carry a great deal of genuine capability do not, as a rule, feel compelled to display it where it can be seen. He said that the most dangerous and the most valuable and the most remarkable people he had encountered in 31 years had, almost without exception, been the ones he had learned to look at more carefully than their surfaces invited him to look. And the count is still rising. He said that if a young sailor takes nothing else from anything he ever says in the entirety of a ceremony, that this young sailor will probably not remember in its specifics in 20 years. Take this. The person who does not need you to know what they are is almost always the person who knows exactly what they are. He sat down to an ovation that lasted longer than he felt comfortable with. He did not mention the corridor. He did not mention the hatch. He did not mention the woman with the gray eyes, and the worn notebook, and the laminated card, and the answer that a room full of capable officers had been unable to find. He didn't need to. The people in that room who had been on the baton that morning understood exactly what he was talking about. The people in that room who had not been on the baton that morning understood that they were hearing something that had a specific and particular origin, a real story behind the words, something that had happened in a real corridor to a real person who had stood in it without complaint and without announcement and without the need to say a single word about what she was. The story moved, as stories of this kind move, through the community of people who heard it, and the people who heard it from those people, and the people who heard it from them, in the way that true things move when they are also instructive things, when they contain in them something that people recognize as worth carrying and passing on. It became, in the specific and irreplaceable vocabulary of the service, a thing that is not quite a legend and not quite a cautionary tale, and is something that encompasses both without quite being either. It became a teaching story. The kind of story that senior enlisted personnel tell to junior sailors, not to punish them and not to frighten them, but to equip them, to give them a map of a kind of situation that they will encounter in some form in their own careers, with their own versions of the corridor and the hatch and the unmarked uniform and the question they will have to decide in a moment, with whatever information they have. The question being, what do you actually know about this person? And is what you know enough to justify what you're about to do? In the specific version of the story that circulates in certain messes and certain training environments and certain conversations between people who have been around long enough to have accumulated stories of this kind, the emphasis falls differently in different tellings. In some versions, it is a story about humility, about the cost of assumptions, about the danger of mistaking the absence of display for the absence of substance. In some versions, it is a story about the admiral, about the particular quality of a person who has earned so much and displays so little, about what it takes over a career of the length and weight of hers to remain that still and that patient in a corridor, to wait without complaint while a young man performs his authority for an audience, and to respond not with the full force of what you are, but with the quiet offer of what you know, the thing that is actually useful, the thing that actually matters. In the best versions of the story, it is both. It is about all of them, about the young man who made the mistake and carried it correctly, about the Master Chief who watched from the shadow and knew what he was seeing, about the commander who made a decision in a corridor based on something she trusted without fully understanding, about the admiral who waited without resentment and offered without fanfare and produced, from the worn pages of a notebook, the single piece of information that a room full of capable people needed because she had been there, had done that specific thing in a specific place 7 years before, and had kept a personal copy of it because that is what people who are very good at very important things do. They keep the receipts, not for display, for use. There is a particular thing that happens in the formation of a military professional over the span of a long career. It is not visible, and it does not announce itself, and it is not the result of any single experience or any single decision. It is the accumulated result of thousands of decisions, thousands of moments in corridors and briefing rooms and training environments and theaters of operation, each one calling for a specific response, each response either expanding or contracting the person's capacity, over time, in the specific direction of what they are becoming. The Admiral had been becoming, for the better part of 30 years, the person who stands in the corridor with the notebook. Not because she was assigned to become that. Not because someone told her that patience is a professional virtue and stillness is a tactical asset and the absence of display is, in its own way, a form of mastery that takes longer to develop than any technical skill and is rarer than any clearance level. But because she had observed, across those years, that the people she respected most, the people whose judgment she trusted most, the people she had seen operate in the most difficult conditions with the most at stake, were almost invariably the people who were quietest when the room was loudest, and most certain when the situation was least clear, and most useful precisely when usefulness was hardest to perform. She had decided, at some point far enough in the past that she could no longer identify the moment, to try to become that. She had been trying, imperfectly and persistently, ever since. The worn notebook was part of it. The habit of keeping personal copies of things that matter. The habit of recording not just what happened, but what was learned. The habit of carrying the record close, not for display, but because the record is the thing itself, the actual substance of what a career in complicated work actually is, not the rank on the collar, but the accumulation of solved problems and negotiated agreements, and nights in unfamiliar places, with complicated stakes, and mornings in corridors waiting outside hatchways, because a young man with a list and a loud voice has not yet developed the tools to see what is standing in front of him. The notebook was full of such things. 7 years of such things, on top of the 7 years before that and the 7 years before that. On the page where the laminated card lived, tucked into the margin, was a note in her own handwriting, precise and small. It read, March 2019. 3 days of negotiation. We got the corridor. Worth it. 3 days of negotiation with the UAE Maritime Authority, the meetings in Abu Dhabi, the technical discussions about traffic separation and transit lanes, and the particular geometry of a stretch of water that does not allow for imprecision. The final agreement. The laminated card she had made herself, because she knew, with the practical certainty of someone who has been doing this kind of work for a long time, that the record of a thing is the only guarantee that the thing persists in the institutional memory of an institution that has, like all large institutions, a limited and imperfect institutional memory. She had made the card. She had kept the card. 7 years later, in a corridor on a ship in the Strait, that card was made to protect. It solved a problem that nobody else in the room could solve. This is what preparation looks like, in the long version, the version that does not compress well into a single moment or a single scene. Preparation is not the moment when you produce the laminated card. Preparation is the 7 years of keeping it. The decision, repeated in every move and every deployment and every change of billet, to keep the record because the record is real and everything else is subject to revision. The willingness to carry the weight of what you know, even when there is no immediate audience for it, even when the corridor is empty and the hatchway is closed and you are waiting, without complaint, for the room to need what you have. When the room needs what you have, you will be ready. That is the whole of the lesson. It is enough. There is a story told in certain training environments now, in the specific community of professionals who work in the particular overlap between operational planning and international maritime law, and the complicated negotiated agreements that govern the use of shared water in unstable parts of the world. It is a story about a restricted airspace corridor and a laminated card and a worn notebook and a woman who waited in a corridor without complaint and then solved in 60 seconds what a room full of capable officers could not solve in 47 minutes. In the version told by the people who train the people who do this work, the emphasis falls on the notebook, on the habit of the notebook, on the discipline of keeping the record and keeping it close, and understanding that the record is not the past but the present, because the past does not stop operating just because you have moved on from it, and the agreements you made, and the corridors you established, and the cards you laminated are still out there, still governing the movement of aircraft and the transit of ships, and the decisions of rooms you haven't been in yet. The record is the future. The notebook is the weapon. The quiet professional is the one who carries both, and never needs to say so. There is a recruit somewhere, today, who will hear a version of this story, who will hear it in a training environment, or a mess, or a late conversation with a master chief who served with someone who was on the baton that morning, who will hear the specific shape of it, the corridor and the hatch and the loud voice and the quiet eyes and the 60 seconds and the laminated card, and who will carry it with them in the way that true instructive things are carried, not as information, but as orientation, as a way of reading the world and the people in it, and the situations that will present themselves in corridors and briefing rooms and all the other places where the question will arise, again, of what this person actually is and whether you have enough information to decide. And the right answer, always, is to ask more carefully, to look more completely, to be the person in the shadow of the frame support who sees what the room cannot see. And if you are fortunate enough to be the person with the notebook, to keep the notebook faithfully, and to wait without complaint, and to offer without fanfare the thing that is actually needed, and then to find a quiet corner while the aircraft launch and the work gets done, because the work getting done is the whole of the point, and everything else is just corridor. The most dangerous room in any building is the one where everyone knows exactly who the most capable person is without being told. The Admiral went back to Bahrain. She had 3 other things to do. The day was not over. For more stories where quiet competence humbles loud arrogance, subscribe to Old Bill's Tales. And if you'd like to help me keep telling them, you'll find my Patreon linked in the description below. Thank you for standing with me.